It must be so hard for you to not accept your child. And I would say, what are you afraid of?
Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Joe, and I'm the dad.
And I'm Rya, and I'm the daughter.
Hey, I was in the restaurant the other day. I'd ordered a burger. The waiter came over and he had his thumb on my burger.
That's strange.
I thought so, too. And I said, why do you have your thumb on my burger? He said, so it won't fall on the floor again.
We've got a real treat for you today. We are here with Michael Larkey, who is a licensed clinical social worker. We've got a lot here to talk about, so let's just jump in. Michael, would you introduce yourself?
Of course, it's a privilege to be here. My name is Michael Larkey. I have been a licensed clinical social worker since 2004. I worked in a variety of settings, from hospitals to clinics, volunteer work. I currently am at ThedaCare, which is a larger medical system in the Fox Valley in Wisconsin. And I'm here today to talk about mental health and how it affects people in the LGBTQ plus community, as well as allies and people that are not part of that community as well.
Is LGBTQ your specialty?
It is not my specialty. I am a member of that community. As a gay man, I've been in a relationship with my partner for about 20 years, so it's of particular interest to me. And I've had a lot of training in that area. We call ourselves eclectic when it comes to licensed clinical social workers, and seeing all sorts of people. I would say most things we see are depression and anxiety, relationship issues, and stress.
Oh, so those are all politicians, is that right?
Some probably need to come in, but
yeah, I think so.
Would you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. I was born in New York City, and my parents and family moved out to Wisconsin when I was young. And so really had the urban experience, and then as a young man, and then got a more suburban experience and was in a more rural area. So it was interesting to have all those different backgrounds and see different stories. And my mother was a social work professor, a therapist for many years. And that's why I got into the field. And I think that her empathy for other people really kind of helped me see that that's a profession I'd want to go into too. One point I wanted to be a lawyer and took the LSAT and did well enough to get into some law schools, but decided at the last minute to kind of switch it around and got into the area of social work, worked in a crisis center, worked in several hospitals, things like that. And before I ended up at ThedaCare, over the course of time working there, seeing that the services were not really, I think, adequate for the trans community, for people in the gender spectrum, I learned more about it. I ended up going to some trainings about it, talking to people about it, reading about it. And once you put yourself out there and let the people know that you are working with that community, people tell their friends by word of mouth. People tell their people they know, because people are looking for affirming services. When people enter into mental health, they want to be understood. They don't want to have to explain their entire life from square one. They want people to have some knowledge about that. So one thing I'd say to the people that are listening is, if you are in need of mental health services, make sure that when you approach somewhere, to talk to the supervisor, the person in charge of assigning therapists, and ask them what therapists they have there that might be able to have that ability to work with people in the community you're in, whether you're part of the trans community, whether you're a parent or an ally, whether you're someone dealing with any other issue. Ask about their expertise and their ability to work in that area, so you don't just get the next person in rotation.
I get asked occasionally, are there really a lot more people out there in the LGBTQ community now, or is it just that they're more comfortable coming out? Is the percentage the same?
I think that scientifically the percentage is probably the same, but you raise a really good point. I think of the issue that you hear about autism or ADHD, when people will say, well, now I hear all these things about autism or ADHD. Is there more now? Well, we didn't know about it then, and people were not comfortable coming out because it was stigmatized and not well researched. So I completely agree, Joe, that when people are more comfortable coming out, when there's more affirming services available, when people see people that are out and living their lives in ways that make them productive and happy, the more people are comfortable coming out and talking about their stories. And then it's going to seem like there are more people. But I think that it's always been probably around the same amount of people. It's just, were they able to express who they really were?
Is there a predominant concern among the LGBTQ people from their association with religion, or is it people who are not allies, or is it government concerns? What's the most predominant concern?
I think it crosses the board based on individual's experience in a community. What maybe was the most painful to them when they were growing up? If their family was in a religious tradition and they felt rejected by that, then that might be something they need to unravel and they might need to talk about and unwind with somebody. Other times they might be working in a work environment that's toxic to them and they might be discussing that. A lot of times it's about family and how they're able to relate to their families, how they're able to come out to their families and be seen as a whole person and not something that's lesser. And so I think that all the concerns you brought up are, I think, across the board concerns for people. And individually, people are their concerns. One thing that I do think about when you mention that is we all as human beings share similar concerns. I imagine everybody or most everybody has depression, anxiety, issues with insecurity, self-judgment, shame in their lives. I almost want to widen it out about mental health for all of us to say our concerns are unique, they're specific, and that people should be approaching that from that angle, that idea of what's unique to me.
Can you tell me and describe the difference between your work as a clinical social worker and a mental health therapist, or what are the various categories and what do you do specifically?
That's a good distinction to make, Rya, because it comes up a lot. Sometimes people call me doctor, which I'm sure my mother loves, but I am not a doctor. I have my master's in social work. So there's different people that see people in counseling and do talk therapy. And that the general place in Wisconsin, that's typically a licensed professional counselor, which means they have their master's in that area, or a licensed clinical social worker. We're equivalent in many ways, and my colleagues are going to be divided between those two. That you differentiate between that and a psychiatrist who's a medical doctor. And that person is going to generally be managing medications that are psychotropic or for psychological reasons. They should do some talking to the person about how their life is going, how the meds are working for them. But they're talking about how the physical symptom, the organic kind of effects of the meds are having on them. A psychologist kind of falls in between. Many psychologists do testing for things like autism or neurodivergency, or if somebody is looking to see if they have ADHD. They may also do talk therapy. PhD psychologists will do that as well. But generally, say at Data Care where I work, a lot of psychologists do testing, and the licensed professional counselors, we're doing the talk therapy. So that's where somebody enters a session and has an assessment done, and they talk about their life and what's going on in their life. And then the therapist works with them, hopefully using evidence-based kind of modalities to talk to them about how they can have a quality of life that's improved. That's kind of the North Star and the goal, I think, of therapy. Each person has unique problems and issues, and we want to improve their quality of life.
You mentioned evidence-based modalities. Would you describe what that is?
Yes, and it's great for people to know that. First of all, that's why you want a licensure, that there can be people out there that are a life coach, things like that, and they can be wonderful. The thing that when you're licensed is that if you run into any trouble, the person is kind of accountable. That just as if you went to somebody that was going to fix your plumbing, you'd want to go to someone that's licensed just in case they did something that was wrong. What are you going to do? Modalities is the idea of what is a person using that has evidence-based through research over time. Some of those things might be cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, which is one of the more familiar ones to people. Dialectic behavioral therapy, or DBT, is another one that's very common. That's emotionally based. How do people regulate their emotions? I'm explaining these things very briefly, but there's complexity that people can certainly look up and try. And there's mindfulness, which I think is something that's talked about a lot. Being present in the moment and not worrying about the future, not being stuck or ruminating about the past. So staying in the present moment. Those are kind of three legs that I work on. There are other forms of therapy, internal family systems, solution-focused therapy. There are lots of ways, there are lots of roads to the mountain, as they say, both in how people can get better and modalities they can choose. I often think myself that it's best to kind of look it up and see what you think of it. Talk to your therapist or your provider about what kind of works for you, because for different people, it's going to be different. And it's good to have a lot of tools, I think, to use.
So in other words, it's more than just you're somebody that has empathy and you kind of have good advice for people.
That's right. As the field has progressed over time, it's moved from just the supportive, empathetic kind of professional to somebody that hopefully is looking at what the outcomes are, like what is working with somebody. And that's an ongoing dialogue. And I really like the idea in my background as a social worker that you're equivalent to the person. You're on a team with somebody and you might have some knowledge and they have knowledge about their life. So it's going back and forth as a conversation. And you want it to be fluid and flexible, I think, because things change. You might pick from something this time, something else from another time. Speaking about therapy is such a broad topic that there are people that say might have trauma in their lives that might do a very structured form of therapy. Other times people might have a more fluid form of therapy and be choosing from different modalities at that time. I will say the interesting thing is they say in survey after survey of people, when they research this, is the most important thing that they have from a therapist that leads to positive outcomes is authenticity, which I think is a really interesting conversation to have when we're on this kind of podcast in itself. Is someone becoming their authentic self? Is their therapist authentic? I think of for people in the LGBTQ plus community, authenticity is often the idea. Am I living my life in an authentic way? I've had many people tell me that how they came out was because of the fact that they didn't want to die, not knowing that anyone knew who they really were. And I had that experience. My coming out process, and I had a very supportive family, was around a sophomore in high school, was when the process first started. But I was flying to Europe and I had the thought that I might die in a plane crash. And it really bothered me that nobody would ever know what my life really was. That authenticity informs my practice and that sense of what other people are, that, you know, if we shut off people, whoever they are, I mean, if you are not a member of that community, think about all the things that you don't share with people that are important to you, that when you're living your life, that you wouldn't want to end it without people knowing that. That's often a sadness for people.
A lot of our listeners know that we often recommend that they seek professional guidance and professional help. But there are people who resist that. What would you say to those people that are just not ready to come in?
I think that it takes such bravery to be vulnerable to a stranger. I hear people oftentimes, and not to gender it, but I'll say many people will say, my husband, for example, my boyfriend does not want to come in because they haven't been taught, as males are often not growing up in the country, idea of emotional fluidity or being able to talk about our emotions. So to answer your question, Joe, I think that I first would acknowledge how scary it is for people to talk about things with somebody that is a stranger. The cool thing about this, I think, is that getting somebody in the crack of the door and saying, well, would you talk to somebody one time or come to this group one time, often works because people's worst fears they're catastrophizing about, they're thinking they're going to be judged. And when you're seeing a practitioner in an environment where it feels safe to you and you go into it, I have seen people join groups that were, I'm going to use a demographic, Joe, an older white male that comes in there and says to me, I don't know if I can do a group about anxiety or depression, but I just really have a lot of it. And they get in there. A vast majority of time, they'll say later, that was so good for me that someone saw me and heard me. And their fear, I will say often, is that they're going to be judged and it's going to be scary and they're going to be forced to talk about things they don't want to talk about. I often think they think it's going to be like the old Bob Newhart show for people who might have seen that in the 70s, where people are just kind of talking with each other, you know, and chatting and like, I'm going to say this or that. And it's not. It's the idea of there's a structure. To go to Rya's point earlier is you want to create a safe environment for people where they can be themselves, but also know it's structured. So it takes a lot of courage. And I'm always honored and in awe of people that are able to come in and talk about things with somebody they do not know and get better. And to open the door for people, if they have a spouse, a child, someone that they know, they're just thinking about it, I often say, maybe go with them to the first session and maybe say, can you try this once? Because when you try something once, you think about your own life. This is the first time I've been on a podcast. You know, driving here, I had a little bit of anxiety. But once you start doing something, you realize your worst fears aren't going to happen.
We're really glad that you came here to join us today. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
You mentioned authenticity. I think it's easy to fool ourselves into thinking, I'm being authentic, I'm living my authentic life, and really we're holding things back. Do you have any indicators of what someone might look for in their own life to realize maybe this is an issue that I should be looking at?
I do think that most of us have things that we wall off. There are things that are private we want to keep private. There are things that we are maybe in between. There are things that we feel like we have to express. I don't have an easy, simple answer to that, but I do think that a productive and healthy way of looking at that is to say, what am I afraid of? I often think that anxiety is at the root of most things that people do, both in our society and individually, of most things that are not good and not healthy in their lives, that are destructive to themselves or other people. So if you are feeling something, to pause for a moment, think about, what is making me anxious about this? If, for example, I am somebody that really has always wanted to be a writer, but it's scaring me and I don't want to tell anybody else about that, I can pause and think, what about that is causing me to feel that way? So what about that authenticity is going to make my life more healthy? To examine anxiety, pause. The second thing I'd say about that is also to go back to Joe's question about people entering into a therapeutic environment, is the idea that we often go with our first emotion, which is first equals worst often when it comes to that. Our first emotion is often our strongest, most fearful. Like, think about when you get that email at work and somebody says something and you're like, I just want to write back to that person right away. And I think most of us know it's not a good idea. Out of experience, I probably have done or said something once or twice where I thought, I wish there was a 5-second pause button that would resolve most of my problems. The idea of get the first emotion, deal with it, and then get to your second or third emotion. There's a concept in dialectic behavioral therapy called wise mind, which is the intersection of emotional thought, like one circle, and our rationality or intellectual thoughts. And we get that middle ground of both my emotions informing my intellectual part and my intellectual part informing my emotional part. So kind of pausing for a moment and then getting to our second or third reaction to something. And that often is our better, more informed, healthier reaction.
What would you tell a listener who is not accepting of their child?
First of all, I'd say I have empathy for you because it must be so hard for you to not accept your child. And I would say the same question I'd say to Rya, and that would be, what are you afraid of? Sometimes people don't accept their children because they're afraid about what's going to happen to them. Sometimes it's the grief of not following a life that they thought and imagined what was going to go on with them. And it goes back to authenticity. When it's all said and done, as far as I know, we only get one go around in these forms that we have here today. And the idea that, like, what do we want that to be like? So if you're struggling with acceptance, I just think examine yourself and say, what is my anxiety about? Is it about this person? Is it about what I know? Is it about beliefs I have? And engage. Don't close the door. Why do we ever have to close the door to anything unless it's harmful to us? Think about the idea of saying, I'm going to keep that door open, even if it's just a crack, and look at what I'm fearful for. Take a moment and say, what am I afraid of?
I'm Chuck Reynolds, and I started listening to Transcendent because Joe is my friend. I keep listening because I have friends, colleagues, and family members who are part of the LGBTQ community, and I want to better understand their struggles and perspectives. I have become a supporter because I believe Joe and Rya are truly helping to preserve relationships and save lives. Join me in supporting Transcendent. Just go to transcendent.com, click on support, and select the amount you'd like to give each month. It can be as little as $3, and you can cancel at any time.
Would you talk a little bit about why it's important, especially for those of us in the gender diverse community or in the larger LGBTQ plus community as a whole, to seek somebody out?
Yes, that's a great question, Rya. The Williams Institute at UCLA did a study in 2023, a research-based study that said 81% of transgender adults had thought about suicide. 42% had attempted it, and 56% of transgendered adults engaged in non-suicidal self-injury over the course of their lifetimes. That's the dire news. That's the dangerous, scary news, why people should be seeking mental health.
And those are even higher statistics than I had been hearing maybe 10 years ago.
Well, I imagine, as Joe was asking about earlier, that when more people are out in the community, they're aware that more people are hearing things and it becomes more of a public issue, that there are both good messages and messages that are dangerous for people to hear. I think often of the GLBT population in the 80s when gay men were facing the HIV and the AIDS crisis. It not only was something that was a holocaust to them, but also at the same time, it generated a lot more people to come out of the closet. That at that point in time, there's a lot of empathy generated from that. Not only was it a dangerous time, but because people banded together and they were seen as human beings, as we were talking about authentically as human beings, people started seeing people, how they were able to care for each other, much like the trans community is being seen as now, as they're being oppressed in some ways, as they're dealing with issues that are difficult. More people are seeing them authentically. The good news about this is that 82% of the people in the trans community have access to mental health services. They access them as adults, as opposed to 47% of the cis community. So they're accessing the mental health care. We need then professionals that are able to address those needs of people that are trying to access those care. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today.
That's great news, and we don't get a lot of good news right now.
The other thing I'd want to talk about along those lines, just in general about mental health, that people can use in their homes right now without accessing a service or talking to a professional, is I just think about the fact that we are the stories that we tell ourselves each day. The idea of what shaped your story and manifests your story with the support of people in your lives. I'm talking to a father and daughter here today. they are able to tell their stories. When people hear those stories, it gives validity to their lives, and they can look at hope. We live on hope. And the idea is that every day, whoever you are that's listening to this, whoever you are, you're always telling yourself a story about your life each day. That's how we are who we are. What is that story going to be? I was listening to one of your earlier podcasts, and you talked about cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, like the idea of how do we shape that story? Some things we're thinking might be distorted, like when people are not coming out, when people aren't visible, we might feel really isolated. We might be talking to a child, in rural Idaho right now that doesn't think another trans person exists, or a woman in the middle of Texas who thinks, I don't think anyone understands what it's like not wanting to be able to leave my home, and I'm anxious, and my husband doesn't know, and my children don't know. And these are things I hear about every day. And oftentimes I could look out the window and say the next 3 people that walk by are going to have anxiety disorders, or what we could say clinically diagnosed as anxiety disorders. Yet they often will say, I thought I was alone, until they talked or saw other people or came to a group and saw other people in those groups. There's such a power in people telling their stories and being able to hear that, because we can imagine other people might feel the way we do, or maybe we can't. But it becomes real, and it's manifested in our lives when we see people across from us that are dealing with those stories. So reach out, find support, look for people that are able to tell their stories, whoever you are.
That's one of the reasons we recommend organizations like PFLAG. They get together and they learn from each other.
Absolutely. And when I was talking about suicide earlier, certainly you can utilize the Trans Lifeline 988, contact services like the Trevor Project. Call and ask your local area, wherever you're listening to this from. Use your internet. Find out where there are groups that meet, social groups, support groups. There are formalized therapy groups. I run anxiety groups and depression groups. Yet there are a lot of groups where people are just meeting to get support. Those are not skills-based. They're not evidence-based, but they're very, very important. They can be more valuable than anything. Sometimes people have said to me, knowing one other person was dealing with what they were going to was enough to get them through that period of time in their life. So that's why it's so important, as we're talking here, that theme of authenticity, that theme of being able to tell our stories to each other. We don't all share the same stories. How could we? But, we can learn from each other's stories. That's where empathy comes from. That's where families, when maybe they're struggling with their child's sexual identity, their orientation, their gender identity, maybe their mental health issues. That's why hearing their story, validating it, and listening, while you have your story, you're telling back to them. It's an openness there then.
We talked earlier about the difference between therapy as having a discussion and also then kind of the other side with a psychiatrist, somebody that might be looking at more of the physical side of things. Would you talk a little bit about somebody that's struggling with anxiety and wrestling with, do I want to try a medication? Is maybe talk therapy something better? What's your perspective on that? And how does somebody figure out what's the right solution for them?
It is complex, Rya. The first thought I start for on the blank page is get an assessment done. Start with a lot of people access mental health services through their primary care physician initially, and there are, wherever you're at, there are people, social workers right in the office that work with people. But your question in particular is an important one in that there are many roads to the mountain. Some people might have terrible panic attacks and might need medication to cure that, to set the stage to do talk therapy. Sometimes people just have talk therapy. Sometimes they just take medications. Sometimes they just go to a social support group. Have a lot of tools available at your disposal. Try things on. Think about your life in this way. When we are starting a career or trying something out or deciding what color to paint your house, you might look at many things and look at those things and say, what might work for me? Try something. Many of these things work complementary to each other. So they're available to you. Starting out, find someone you trust. If it is your family physician, it could be someone, if you're a churchgoer, it could be a pastor. It could be somebody that you believe in, a friend. Ask them, begin the conversation. When you access services, have that full conversation with somebody, asking about all alternatives to what you want to do, and then decide, looking at evidence, which ones you want to try. There's not a right or wrong answer to that. Have many tools at your disposal. For all of us, think about all the tools we use every day to get through each day.
When somebody comes in for the first time, or maybe after you've established your relationship and they're starting to feel open enough to tell you their story, What are some of the common misconceptions that people might have, or maybe techniques where you discovered that reframing their story might be a little better?
Oftentimes, people are their own worst critics. The first thing I think that people realize is that when you think about your life, think about the things that you do to yourself that you would never do to another person. How would you treat a good friend versus how you would treat yourself? So when I hear people's stories, it's really interesting when you do an intake, when someone first comes in to meet with you. A lot of what you're talking about are the problems that exist, and that's understandable. If I break my ankle, I'm going to go into my doctor's office and talk about my broken ankle. In this area, when someone comes in, they're talking about what's difficult for them, what's challenging. About 3/4 of the way through, so that might be 30, 40 minutes, there's a question or some type of question about what are your strengths? What's something that's supportive to you? And I will tell you, sometimes people look like you hit them with a dead fish. They will be quiet. They will look like just shocked. And it's really interesting about us as human beings that it's really kind of easy in those environments for some people, for many people to talk, here I am to get help. Here's all my flaws laying out on the table. I'm being vulnerable, which is so brave. And then you say, can you say something good about yourself? And they can't. And interestingly, when I've talked to someone for 30 or 40 minutes, I often can say things right back to them and say, well, you told me you love animals. You have a lot of empathy. And they'll be, yeah. Why can't they say that themselves? So that misconception in reframing is often that you're looking at it like, honestly, it goes back to the groups, that you're alone in this, that there's not hope. And I think a lot of times when we're in our own heads, we don't think that we can change, but we can always think other people will change because we see that all the time. But because we're in our own script, we often think, I'm not going to change. My depression, my anxiety is never going to leave me because that's the way I live. But if you simply ask yourself, do you think that person over there could change that? Most people are going to say yes because they see that process all the time happening.
So I feel like there's sometimes where we see somebody else externally. Like when I look at my neighbor, if I don't like how she is appearing or what she looks like right now, there's nothing I can do about that. So it's not going to be charitable for me to be judgmental towards her. On the other hand, when I look in the mirror, there are plenty of things that I can do. So I have a vested interest in being judgmental towards myself so that I can make sure that I stay away from the things that I dislike. When does that become a problem?
That is defined by the individual when it is affecting the quality of your life. If you're ever thinking about, I would guess, a great question is when someone has anxiety or depression, for example, since most of us as human beings experience that, when they're thinking, when do I need help for it? I think the first thing to do is kind of pause and think, how is this impacting areas of my life, the major areas of my life? How am I interacting with my family, my friends, my job? Things are important to me. How am I sleeping? How am I functioning? Look at how the functionality is existing in your life for those things and see how it's impacting that. So I use a different word, Rya. If someone is kind of taking an inventory of themselves and thinking, what could I improve on, using that kind of positive language, I don't think that's judgment. That's the idea of I want to make myself better and I want to be happier. Looking at that, examine what you think that you can change, what you'd like to change, and how it's impacting you. Other things might be just fine. And you talk about your neighbor, I think of something else when it comes to mental health. I think of people in the trans community that I work with as well. And that is the idea of comparison. I have no problem saying that I am 54 years old. And when I was growing up, we'd often compare ourselves to, I don't know, maybe like 20 people or so, or maybe 10 that we went to high school with. Now people can compare themselves to 50,000 people they see on the internet every day. And am I passing? Am I good enough? What about my weight? What do I look like? These are things I hear all the time. They're real. The struggle is real. Besides limiting our contact with that, there's the idea of, I like the Chinese saying of comparison is the death of joy, that there are always going to be people above us and below us on the ladder, and kind of trying to move ourselves out of that and saying, how am I doing? What's going on with me? Comparison is just I can't tell you the amount of people across the board, every age, every demographic, that at some point is going to say something to me in the role of my job, almost everybody, about how it's really hard for them because they see other people are doing better, they're passing better, they're making more money than me, they're going on these vacations, because that's really what the algorithms show to us when we look at our Facebooks, when we look at our Instagram, look at our TikTok. These people are living these happy lives and not realizing that this is just a glimpse into things. It's not life.
I remember being extremely surprised one time when I watched a very popular transgender YouTuber, gorgeous, best passing voice I've ever heard. Everything about her was amazing. She confessed at a point of vulnerability, how concerned she was that she wasn't measuring up to her own standard. And I thought, you've got to be kidding, because to me, you are the standard that I want to reach up to. I have heard the same from others that have looked to me and have said, I wish that I could be as passing as you. And I think to myself, are you kidding? I am by no means a standard. And I certainly experience that on both sides. I feel like that is very, very common.
It is such an issue for people across the board, from adolescents to people in the trans community to, I think, every adult in America at this point. The idea that, that we're living up to this algorithm, or this idea that we're comparing ourselves and where we're at in that ladder. And I think the best news I was told, it's not like I don't do this myself at times, is just I remind myself that there are going to be people above and below us in different areas all the time. And what can I do myself? And it's so arbitrary. It goes back to that self-criticism that I think people outside of, sociopaths and narcissists, most people are going to do that comparison. And that's difficult. And kind of, you can visit there, just don't stay there. Go there and kind of have that first emotion again, then move on to the second emotion and the third emotion, and remind yourself that this is not real life when I'm seeing somebody and looking that way, and see if you can't get to a more healthy place that way.
If somebody is in this perpetual cycle where they're having trouble breaking it, do you have any tips to give someone?
I think of mindfulness, grounding ourselves. At the moments where you could wake up at 3 a.m. and feel like that I'm off the rails, I feel like I'm going a little bit quote unquote crazy. There's importance to grounding ourselves. And this is where you can use the internet. There's lots of tips about diaphragmatic breathing and grounding oneself. When we're really having a difficult time with anxiety, depression, panic attacks, feeling really outside of our heads, besides contacting and talking about it with a person you trust, one of the Trans Lifeline 988, a professional. For yourself, if you're there, 2 things: ground yourself, look up grounding techniques. 2, do something else. Get your mind out. Don't stay there ruminating. Most people do not wake up at 3 a.m. and think about a great party they were at when they were in high school. They think about problems. That's called the human bias towards negativity. We're always solving problems. So at those moments, do something else. If you're playing solitaire on your phone, etc., move on to something else, and then continue to process and get help depending on where you're at that moment and where you're going.
Is there something that we haven't asked you that you'd like to make certain that our listeners hear?
I just want to reiterate the idea that we're all worthy. Our stories are all worthy. Our authentic stories are all worthy. And when you're in a spot that is really bad for you, when you're feeling like you don't want to go on, it's important to reach out for hope wherever you find it, whether it's with a professional or not. And remember that your story is authentic. It's told every day. And sometimes if you are being invalidated, it feels like that's not real. But remind yourself that your story matters.
One story that always matters is the story that you'll hear on this podcast.
Well, absolutely.
We're grateful to have you coming back week after week. And Michael, thank you for joining us here today. We're grateful to have you here.
It was a privilege. It was nice meeting you both.
We hope to have you back again sometime.
Thanks much. I'd be honored.
If you have any questions that you would like to ask Michael or ask to Dad or me, you can email us. Our email is transcendent@gmail.com.
And with that, we'll see you Monday.